So we have our next Fireside chat, crypto regulation in the UK. Dr. Desné Masie from Global Counsel, George Morris from Simmons and Simmons, and Gabriel Huntley from Headland Consultancy. Please give them a warm welcome to the mezzanine stage, everyone.
Hi everybody, thanks for joining in this afternoon, and to my fellow panelists. So we've had quite a wild ride with crypto assets over the past 2 years, from the giddy highs of 20,000 at the end of 2017 down to $3,000 at the beginning of this year. The price has now corrected to about $8,000 today, as regulators worldwide are beginning to create frameworks for crypto assets, and as people are beginning to understand the asset class a little bit better. In the UK, the pace has been slower than maybe some of the competing markets, so the consultation closed in March of 2019, and at the moment is with the regulators. The findings are due to be released in June. This was after there was a big crypto assets task force, the tripartite task force between the Treasury, the Bank of England, and the Financial Conduct Authority. Now we're waiting for those findings to come out over summer, and then there'll be a second consultation about where the regulatory perimeter ought to be moved. But I'm not going to delve into that. My two expert guests know a lot more than I do. I'm going to get them to do the heavy lifting for me in this session. So I think, George, we were speaking earlier about how some people in the UK industry thought that maybe the FCA came out a bit slowly, with regulations relative to centres like Jersey, Malta, Gibraltar, and Switzerland. But that's been kind of interesting because we've sort of had people developing without a framework. So I don't know if you maybe want to talk a bit more about your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I'm quite loud. So you're absolutely right. The UK hasn't been moving as fast as some other jurisdictions. So we do have jurisdictions like Gibraltar, Malta, other sort of more offshore or semi-offshore jurisdictions that have moved faster than us. And that has meant that they've managed to gain a competitive advantage in some particular parts of this market. One of the things I would say about on the positive side for the UK and the approach that's been taken is that you have to bear in mind that we are starting from a basis of crypto assets being essentially unregulated in most senses. And so, although we haven't moved that quickly, we have been starting from a basis of, actually being quite permissive and slowly moving towards a more restrictive position around crypto assets and how we deal with them in the UK. So whilst we haven't moved that quickly, it hasn't necessarily been that bad a thing for the industry itself. But what that has meant, though, is that in the absence of regulation, we have had the industry growing up in certain different ways as a result of just the lack of kind of regulatory framework. So as I spoke about on the previous panel I did downstairs, the industry is very much two-tier at the moment as a result of the lack of regulation. And this is globally rather than just UK. But this two-tier system has meant that you do have certain players within the market who are very kind of, operate at the less legitimate end, and players in the market who try their best to be as legitimate as possible. So you see some people going for things like e-money licenses in the UK, full-on brokerage type licenses, and then you see others who are trying to utilize the lack of regulatory framework to the best extent possible to make money very fast. It's not necessarily illegal, but what it does do is it creates an overall position that regulators are uncomfortable with, which is we're in an unregulated world at the moment in the UK. We're moving towards a more heavily regulated space. The FCA and the other regulators, therefore, are looking at how the market is growing up to work out how heavily they need to regulate. They look at that two-tier approach being taken, and they say, well, how are we possibly going to be in a situation of being able to regulate light touch to enable growth to flourish and innovation to flourish, if by regulating in a light touch fashion, we would be essentially legitimizing the entire industry, including those elements which we're not necessarily that comfortable with. So that's kind of where we've got to in the UK in terms of a lack of regulation. Where we need to move to now, and I'm sure Gabriel will talk about politically how this happens, but from a kind of regulatory perspective, as you said, we had the consultation on the existing regulatory perimeter, and we're waiting for the results of that. I understand that pretty soon after we get the results of that, we'll get the next consultation, which is about extending the FCA's perimeter into new regulatory territory around crypto assets. that for me is going to be the really crucial bit, because that's when the FCA shows its hand about how it's actually how it wants to regulate this sector. And at the moment, it's very difficult to know whether they're going to come out with something favourable or something incredibly unfavourable.
Well, I mean, we talk about the regulatory perimeter. Maybe just, for people in the room who are not, experts in the daily language of this kind of stuff, the regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, is mainly concerned with consumer protection, market integrity, and preventing financial crime. And then, of course, within that, nobody, unless you're an outright fraudster, if you're genuinely interested, as a market actor, consumer, or creator of one of these products, you don't really want to fall foul of the laws as they exist. And I think what's been interesting about crypto is we've seen a lot of people welcoming regulation and really making efforts to regulate themselves. And I think when we talk about the current regulatory perimeter, George, you can correct me if I'm incorrect here, we're talking about not falling foul of the securities laws. I think that's been one of the main considerations as well as the consumer protections and so on. Like we saw with a lot of the ICOs, turned out to be quite fraudulent, not helped by Neural Rubini trolling the Twitter community as well. So I think that, kind of created a bit of a shock. So now I think, there's all these different kinds of issues. So you've got people using Bitcoins and altcoins as payment, and then people kind of realized that there were stores of value, and you saw this sometimes with, in video games, for example, people sometimes, points and things become valuable within video games. So people started speculating on the crypto currencies. Then they became crypto assets. And I think this has now been, when we talk about the regulatory perimeter, which of these buckets do these things sit on? And in the FCA, when it, in the Taskforce, when it presented, okay, here's some possible things we could do, and they put it to stakeholders, I think they suggested some tokens. So we have 3 buckets of tokens at the moment. Maybe you can talk about where the UK is sitting now in terms of use cases, what the thinking is of that, and what the industry would like and where we're likely to go.
Yeah, so sure. So the STO Consultation, which is in respect of guidance around the existing regulatory perimeter, which a lot of people have now fed into, and we're waiting on the results to get the final guidance. So it's consultation, it's not final guidance. What they said was 3 particular buckets of crypto assets. The first is exchange tokens, which are your traditional is not a great word for it, but your kind of classic crypto assets, Bitcoin, Litecoin, Ethereum, Dash, all those kind of things. Decentralized tokens, blockchain traded. Then you've got security tokens, which are tokenized forms of traditional securities. So your classic kind of taking equity and then tokenizing it onto the blockchain to enable faster transfers, faster settlement, that kind of thing. Security tokens, because they actually, whilst they are tokenized, they still are assets which are within the regulatory perimeter in the same way that classic equity or classic bonds or debt or other regulated instruments would be. And then the final bucket was utility tokens, which in the FCA's parlance was kind of everything else. So we're talking here about obviously ICO tokens that don't currently fall within the regulatory perimeter, so tokens that don't fall within any of the definitions of security, but it clearly is centralized because they are issued by a particular company as part of an ICO. And any other sort of blockchain traded or blockchain settled assets that are somehow, fall within that bucket. One thing that was interesting from the FCA's perspective was that in utility tokens, they also included within that tokens which could represent e-money. Now, in the UK and across the EU, e-money is a regulated product. It's not regulated in the same way as equity or derivatives are, not regulated to the same extent. But it is nonetheless regulated through the electronic money regs and the payment services regulations. And so they put that into the bucket of utility tokens. I think a lot of people have gone back on the consultation to say, actually, we think there should be a 4th bucket for sort of payment-related tokens that are regulated, because in the industry we use the concept of utility token quite often to describe assets which are entirely unregulated. It's not particularly helpful if then the regulator includes e-money within that bucket.
I mean, and I was just going to say, of course, we're talking about the FCA right now, but there are other regulators as well that do have some interest, like the payment systems regulator, where we talk about the digital money and actual payment applications. And then also, the central banks will be interested where cryptocurrencies are used as money and compete with what is called fiat money. So this kind of does open up to all sorts of different, issues. I was wondering, what is at the end of ICOs? I mean, I think, I've heard some venture capital, specialists say that some people are still continuing to use ICOs, but they're very rare. And then we have the STOs, which is, and then there's initial exchange offerings. Are all of those available in the universe right now?
They are. I mean, the fraudulent ICO hopefully is dead, and that's a good reason why the market has dropped off massively.
Yeah.
Because, well, fraudulent for one, and also the purely speculative ICO. The idea of being able to get into an ICO quickly and then get out fast on an exchange and make a quick buck, that doesn't really exist anymore. So actually, most ICOs that launch now, in order to be able to get volume and to get investment, they actually have to have a good idea, which is surprising, right? And then they also have to have a good management team that's actually going to deliver on that idea. And they have to have a good plan on how they're going to deliver on that idea, which, to be frank, has kind of gone full circle back to the way that a VC would look at a traditional equity investment. You've got to have a good plan, you've got to have a good idea that you're going to execute, and you've got to have a good management team behind you. The reality is we should not look at ICOs as being something different from a VC investment. We should just see it as a different way of doing that kind of activity. You still need to have a solid business plan in the background. And if you do that, then there is still the prospect of you raising money. It's a lot harder than it used to be though. STOs are a different story because in the ICO market, it's all very easy, it's unregulated, you can sell on your website worldwide to retail. And that was, an easy way to make a quick buck. And then when the ICO market died, everyone sort of changed the acronym to STO without realizing that actually, so you turn your ICO token into something that's actually regulated without realizing that that is an entirely different ecosystem of how to be able to operate. So if you're an ICO advisor and then you changed your name to STO advisor, I can probably guarantee that you're carrying out a regulated activity of some kind, and you should have FCA authorizations in the UK. But not many people kind of saw that, and this STO bubble arrived. Now, it hasn't been nearly as big as the ICO bubble, but a lot of people got into STOs thinking they were the next big thing without really actually considering the legal issues around it, and the fact that actually STOs at the moment don't solve many problems. All they do is create more issues.
Yeah.
Things like secondary trading at the moment in the European Union, virtually impossible. And impossible for the near future until the EU changes its European level regs around centralized securities depositories and things like that. STOs still have a long way to go, but luckily there are some really credible businesses who are actually putting together solutions which should hopefully fix some of these problems.
Yeah. So I think I was just going to say, if you want to jump in on any of the regulatory points, Gabriel, do feel free to do so. But I wanted to maybe talk about how regulations have come up in this. Gabriel also has worked quite a lot with Crypto UK, which is one of the self-regulating industry bodies, trade associations for people in crypto assets. And I think what's interesting is we've got a very sophisticated, globally networked cryptocurrency community in the UK, but it's not as big as we think it is, even though they're very powerful. And if you maybe talk us through how people have been engaging, with the regulator and with politicians and so on.
Sure. I don't know if people have actually felt that powerful. I think what I'd start by saying is I think that, Crypto UK formed last year as a self-regulatory trade association of some of the big players in the UK to focus specifically on the UK as a market. We came together around the idea of primarily campaigning for regulation and kind of being a voice for the industry in the UK. That's been quite successful, so the argument for regulation has kind of been accepted now, I think, and I think what was driving that was the idea that with regulation comes kind of legitimacy and recognition and kind of access to banking services and what have you. At the moment, as kind of George has said, the debate is very much located with the regulators, policymakers in the FCA and kind of officials in the Treasury. So the kind of locus has moved away from kind of politicians and the media and what have you to these bodies, the kind of regulatory bodies. So that's kind of where our efforts have been focused. I think the important message today is that this will move back again. So Parliament, MPs, members of the House of Lords, the government and ministers will matter again when it comes to implementing whatever the FCA comes back with. And, you know, as you'll all have noticed, we live in very, very turbulent and kind of uncertain political times. And I think crypto regulation, despite being something that's quite technical and quite detailed, isn't immune from that kind of broader context. So at the moment, I think it's really important that the industry doesn't forget that the need to educate, the need to kind of talk to politicians. Because at some point in the next year, we're going to have hopefully secondary legislation that we can kind of feed into and make sure gets the proper scrutiny that it needs. And whilst kind of working on international stage is really important, we're obviously at a juncture where the UK is leaving the EU. Increasingly, there's a debate about whether the UK seeks to follow or to chart its own path vis-a-vis Brussels and kind of financial regulation. And I think it's particularly interesting, given that there is this debate ongoing on kind of, does Britain seek to become kind of a Singapore on Thames? Do we try and kind of chart a different course? And where does that leave crypto regulation? Because we're in the sort of slightly unusual position of saying, as an industry, we want regulation because we think that will help Britain kind of compete on a global stage and will help Britain become a kind of global centre for crypto. But also obviously saying we want regulation to be proportionate, well designed, etc. So in a scenario where you've got a new Chancellor of the Exchequer coming in, someone like Liz Truss, someone who's quite deregulatory in their sort of stance, I think we have to kind of navigate that quite carefully in how we make the argument. And I think there's actually quite a good opportunity for us to make the argument. But I think given all the work that's gone into these consultations, the last thing we want is for kind of all that to go to waste and for government to sort of start from scratch, or just this to get put on the kind of in the box of like too difficult and we won't touch that, because I think we've come a long way. So I think as you said, the political landscape is really important.
I think I know that people have different views on how fast or how slow that regulation. To me, it's felt very slow. But I follow UK regulation on a weekly basis, and I mean, our clients that we advise at Global Counsel, many investment banks. Sometimes we work with startups and crypto asset companies. But I mean, certainly from about October last year until about the parliamentary recess, I was only doing Brexit statutory instruments, and the FCA doing no deal planning, the Bank of England doing no deal planning, and literally it seemed like hardly anything else was happening aside from the work on consumer harms and so on. And I mean, sorry to bring up the B word, but the thing is, I think Brexit has been, my perception has been that it's taken like everything else in government resources away from the regulators as well, and that's my worry that then we still have Brexit's not going to stop on the 31st of October. The implementation of Brexit then has to happen, and I really worry about the innovation side of finance.
Absolutely, and I think there's one of the effects of that is that you've got very little bandwidth, very little kind of attention span or oxygen for other issues. And I think that's something actually we've found with Crypto UK. We have had lots of meetings with MPs. We've met more than 25 MPs and members of the House of Lords. Kind of part of that has been about getting champions on board, so people who do understand the technology, who will kind of go out and bat and sort of actually engage with this properly, that kind of education piece. But there's just so little kind of time and so little energy because people are so focused on the Brexit negotiations that I think we sort of need, when this regulatory process has finished, we need to make sure that we're kind of well placed with knowing who the right people are to speak to, and kind of knowing that this will be high up on the agenda. Because I think that, as I say, I think one of the biggest risks is that it just gets dropped, and we're sort of still in this position in a year, 2 years' time, where there hasn't really been a proper regulatory framework. Or worse, I suppose, that you have a kind of radical Corbyn government coming in, which thinks, okay, crypto assets sounds bad, consumer harm, let's ban it, kind of thing.
You've got to bear in mind, I think, I'm probably in the minority in the UK, but I think actually that the speed of the pace of regulation hasn't been so bad, because one of the things that I'm very aware of is that you need to be careful what you wish for when you're dealing with regulators and trying to ask for regulation. You need to be very clear about what you want. So I think in many ways, actually, the only good thing coming out of Brexit, in my view, perhaps, is that it's taken the focus away from trying to heavily regulate this industry and give us the space in the UK to be able to consolidate before any regulatory action comes down the pipe. So being careful what you wish for in regulation is so important, because if you look at what Kit and Kik are doing in the US at the moment, they're playing in my view, crazy game of taking the SEC on with the hope that they are going to be able to change the law and create a new precedent after the Howey test around the definition of securities. But they are not considering the fact that actually the political wins and generally the wins around crypto in the US are not favourable. And so it could be a situation where actually the Howey test gets even worse, and then you have the Kik test, which would be the new term for the precedent that's now used in terms of working out securities, being worse, and actually potentially saying that existing crypto assets like Bitcoin and Ethereum are regulated financial products, which would be horrific for the industry. So they really need to be careful about that. Yeah. And we need, in the UK, we need to be the same. We should ask for regulation, and it's right that it needs to be regulated, but it needs to be regulated in the right way, or else you're just going to end up in a worse position than you were.
Yeah, I'm just trying to imagine John McDonnell's views on crypto assets. Do we know what John McDonnell thinks about Bitcoins?
He wants to nationalise it. No, we have met with a number of Labour MPs, and there is kind of some interest and so on. I just think the risk, in these kind of really uncertain times, that any new government is just that everything gets thrown away, and there's more uncertainty.
Yeah. I think certainly there's obviously the Brexit risk for financial markets on the horizon, but I think what people keep underestimating is not just the no deal bit, but actually the possibility of a Corbyn government, is not, depending if Corbyn obviously manages to stay in power, with everything else that's going on. But as the risk of no deal Brexit increases, the risk to the Tories' cohesion increases, and the risk of a Labour government increases. There's so many things going on politically. But I think the temperament of regulators are important things. For example, Randall Pauls, who's now the new chairman of the Financial Stability Board, and also head of supervision at the Federal Reserve. He was a Trump appointee to the Financial Stability Board, and he's definitely on the more deregulatory side of things and listens to banks and so on. So I think that's the thing. It'd be really interesting to see who comes in, for example, gets the Bank of England job. Mark Carney was a bit started off a bit anti the crypto assets, but he's pro, he said we could have a Brit coin. It's like lol. But I think what is quite interesting, because we're just on 5 minutes and I'd like to actually move to questions as well. Within the FCA, I think what's been very exciting is, despite all the constraints on regulatory bandwidth, there have been the world-leading Sandbox. The FCA came up with a Sandbox, and there's been some very exciting things happening within the Sandbox. For example, London Stock Exchange's work with Nivora, where it's really sort of looking at, because what people forget, of course, about cryptocurrencies is that Bitcoin was set up as a payment systems protocol, and these big public blockchains are really quite revolutionary, and we're very much at the beginning phase of figuring out how finance might turn out as a result of them. And in fact, the Financial Stability Board itself as well put out a big decentralized finance paper just this week, looking at how what is now called #DeFi might, there's just too much happening in the crypto markets. I can't keep up. After Consensus New York, everyone was talking about DeFi, but I think this is the thing, the unintended consequences of the technology will require regulators to be quite nimble, but I do take my hat off to the FTA. There have been some very exciting things happening.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd say about the Sandbox is that the Sandbox, by its very nature, looks at quite very innovative, very kind of out there ideas.
Yeah.
And the FCA has always said to us, whenever we've talked, and I think this has improved now, but there was always this thing of, we talk to firms in the Sandbox. I think what the FCA has been perhaps sometimes less good at is talking to kind of mainstream big firms in sectors like crypto. So in a way, they're sort of taking things that are slightly more marginal to be the main. So I think it's really to be the kind of main example of what they're trying to regulate. It's really important they talk to kind of the industry as a whole.
The promised land of institutional take-up, and I mean, I think this is the thing. When my mother's trading gets to the point where she's trading bitcoins on her phone, that's when it's going to be revolutionary. When Bitcoin's just something that everybody uses, and there's no, and it's safe. And I think that's when we can take the efficiencies, to mass adoption. That's what I'd really like to see. We have limited time for questions. Is there any burning question over here? Please, can you keep your intervention short and to the point? Thank you.
So to pick up that last comment, and it gels in with what you said, you made a comment, if Bitcoin and Ethereum are regulated, it would be a quote-unquote disaster for the industry. But you said you want to get Bitcoin to the stage where your grandmother and widows and orphans can trade in it safely. It's got to be regulated for that to happen.
I didn't say regulation.
No, I'm saying, I think,
yeah.
well, here, please, your reaction. I believe for that to happen, it has to be regulated. There's no way you can have a new currency appearing in the world and expect to get to widows and orphans and grandmothers using it for everything every day without it being regulated, number one. And number two, you haven't mentioned in all the regulators the ICO and the effect of GDPR, particularly with Article 17 as it applies to blockchain. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, to your first point, there are different flavours of regulation. So if you take in the UK, we have, as I mentioned before, the sort of two-tier system of regulated securities, equities and things, which effectively those markets are available only for a limited proportion of the public. Retail is quite hard to get in unless you go through someone like a broker. And then you have e-money or payment services. Now, my view is, going back to my original point around, Bitcoin and Litecoin, etc., being regulated, being a disaster. That's in the US, where if you change the Howey test, you're basically saying that Bitcoin is going to be a security in the same way that a Microsoft share would be. And the US, that would make it, very difficult to run a crypto exchange. If you're doing it in the UK, my personal view is that we should be doing something around Bitcoin, Litecoin, etc., being kind of e-money equivalent, which means that you have very strict requirements around compliance with respect to the exchanges dealing in them and the companies issuing them, but not necessarily super heavy regulation in terms of people being able to deal in them. And that there needs to be a little bit of a consideration around whether that's the right mechanism. But my personal view is I think that's right. If you do take the route of, like Germany is now proposing to do, of actually having these assets being regulated as securities, proper financial instruments, the whole industry, in my view, certainly the exchange industry, will fall over very fast.
Just one thing that I'm also thinking about is a related point. I think, so just two responses, and then I've got like 30 seconds to make these points. So the one thing is the attitude of serial entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and people who play in the technology space and burn through capital. It's like, are you just doing things to IPO and move on to the next thing, or are you doing things to really be socially revolutionary? I think it's about what motivates people in the background, and of course, they're going to be people in both buckets. And I do think that there are incredibly visionary people in the blockchain and cryptocurrency space, and I hope that that regulation supports what they're trying to do. I was also thinking one thing that's been an inhibitor has been just institutional space. For example, pension funds, certainly in the Nordics and France, the energy intensity and some of the misconceptions about Bitcoin's high energy use has been also an inhibitor, but there's some research coming out by CoinShares, significantly that renewables. I think that's the thing. There's so many things that we don't know and constraints as to what will make people, use the asset class. But there's just been so much misinformation. We have to end there, I'm afraid. I know you want to say something.
I'm going to say something.
Okay, he's going to say
and
something.
And it's just the point that, as an industry, we need to stop, whenever we get attacked by people about things like, energy usage and things, we need to stop trying to then, refute that through our own internal investigations and things that may or may not be correct. I think we just need to look at these things and actually listen to the detractors and actually start thinking about how we can change in order to be able to create something that works for everyone, not just something that works for us.
Well said. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Big round of applause, guys.